Observation. It's one of those things that if you're planning on being an artist, you're just gonna have to learn to master it. Our brains are constantly processing and evaluating information, and this is some pretty amazing stuff. That is until you start just drawing and having a good old time, and one of your non-artistic friends comes up and tells you something just isn't quite right about your drawing. You see, their brain is processing the same information as yours. However, they might not be able to put into words exactly what is off about your drawing.
So you may be asking yourself, I thought I clicked on a shading tutorial. Why are we talking about observation? Well, observation is key to everything in art, but especially for shading. I can't necessarily tell you 1, 2, 3 steps for any shading. You're going to shade, let's say, this wire fence, or foliage, or leaves, or anything like that. You're going to shade differently. So I can't necessarily give you a 1, 2, 3 step in shading, but I can give you 4 helpful tips about observation to help you with shading. And that's what I'm going to be doing today. So, tip number 1. Tip number 1 is light source. You have to think about this. Where is your light source? And I'm sure you've heard this in tons of shading tutorials, but you do need to figure out where your light source is. The topic though that I want to talk about is how many light sources do you have? Typically as an artist, we don't think about this because we usually only use one. Especially in nature or outdoors, you use the glorious sun as your one lighting source. But you can also have 2 or 3, can't get my fingers right now. You can have 2 or 3 different lighting sources, and you typically see that more in indoor environments where you're manipulating a subject such as a still life. So the next thing that you want to think about when you're talking about light source is how harsh is your light. As you can tell right now, I'm in the shade. The sun is at its golden hour, which is the beautiful sunset or sunrise. I'm at sunset. I'm not very much a morning person, but I'm going to show you if I just walk a little bit over here, suddenly right in this area, my sun has become super harsh of a light, and it creates more dramatic shadows on my face. So that's something else you want to keep in mind when you're doing shading. And here, I'll show you even worse. I'm going to turn into a ghost. So that's something that you need to keep in mind. How harsh is your light? The harsher your light, the more dramatic of shadows you're going to have, and the less harsh, the more subtle shadows you're going to have. You're still going to have shadows, but they're going to be more subtle. So that's something else that you need to consider.
I know you've seen them before, the basic tutorials on shading, and normally they look something like this. These are really helpful for basic exercises of understanding where shadows are supposed to go. But let's be honest with ourselves. Jumping from this basic concept to this is very challenging. First, we need to train our brains to see each petal as an individual shape and place that shadow, as we would on the basic shapes from earlier, on the opposite side of where your light source would be. As with the basic shapes from earlier, I'm going to place my shadow on the opposite side of where my light source would be. I'm going to do this using cross-hatching. I enjoy using cross-hatching because it helps show the texture of the petal, and that's something that we don't usually think about. And that brings me to my next point. We need to remember that the shapes that we are drawing, they always have some form of texture. So what does it actually mean to add texture to your drawing? One way you can do this is you have to think about the direction of maybe the veins or the direction of how the light would flow over the object. You can see me do that right here. By curving my lines here, I'm actually showing how the light would slowly wind around this petal, creating the texture of a curve. Another texture I need to think about is where would my dips or my valleys be on my petals. Basically, this means where is my petal going to bend, and is it going to bend inward or outward? Depending on how it's bending is where your shadow is going to dip into it. The third tip I have for you is when you're looking at your rose, or anything for that matter, think about where something might overlap a shape, such as a petal might fall over another petal. You're going to have a shadow there. Also keep in mind, depending on how high that petal is compared to the other one, the higher the petal is, the further the shadow and longer the shadow is going to be cast. Whereas if you have a shorter height, it's going to be less of a shadow underneath. And the last tip of the day, don't be restricted by color. As an artist, don't limit yourself to the norm. Think outside the box and take chances. When you're thinking about shading, don't just use the grayscale. In real life, very rarely are shadows truly gray or black. Remember that color can also communicate value or shading, such as blues and purples for your darker shadows. And then as you move closer to your lighter highlights, maybe use some greens. And then for your brightest highlights, use some creamy yellows or even some oranges to communicate some warmth. I actually discovered this technique by another YouTuber on YouTube, and I honestly can't remember who it was, and I couldn't find where the video was. But basically they were teaching this in a Photoshop tutorial, and I wondered if I could incorporate that into my watercolor. I personally really liked the way this turned out, and I've started using it a lot since I found it a couple years ago.
So those are the 4 tips of how I do shading through observation. If I didn't mention a trick that you use for shading, I would love for you to comment below. I try as best as possible to write you guys back when you write me, so please feel free to comment below. If you like this video, please do the likey, subscribey, YouTubey stuff, and I can't wait to see you next time. I always enjoy teaching you guys.